The hook. The fog seemed to swallow sound itself as Margaret walked down Millfield's single main street, her heels clicking against wet pavement in a rhythm that felt too loud, too exposed. The town looked like something carved from the surrounding wilderness rather than built, weathered storefronts leaning against each other for support, their paint peeling like bark from ancient trees. A few locals watched her from shadowed doorways, their eyes holding the particular wariness reserved for outsiders who arrived asking questions about things better left alone. Dr. Henderson's clinic sat at the end of the street, a converted house with white clapboard siding that had gone grey with neglect. Margaret paused at the front steps, adjusting the strap of her equipment case and forcing herself to breathe. She'd made this same approach countless times during the war, walking into rooms where voices carried death in their coded syllables, where every mistranslated phrase could mean the difference between a successful mission and body bags returning home. But those voices had been human. The door opened before she could knock, revealing a man in his 60s with silver hair and deep lines etched around eyes that had seen too much. "Dr. Whitmore, I presume? I'm Thomas Henderson. Thank you for coming all this way on such short notice." She shook his offered hand, noting the slight tremor in his fingers. "Your letter mentioned some unusual linguistic patterns, Dr. Henderson. I have to admit, the recordings you sent were intriguing." Henderson's laugh held no humor. "Intriguing is one word for it. Come in, but I should warn you, we can only observe them for short periods. Any longer and the headaches become unbearable." The clinic's interior smelled of antiseptic and something else Margaret couldn't identify, a metallic tang that reminded her of lightning strikes. Henderson led her through a narrow hallway lined with medical equipment, much of it bearing scorch marks or displaying error messages on dark screens. "We've had to replace the EKG machine twice," Henderson explained, noticing her gaze. "Whatever they're doing, it plays hell with electronics. The radio station went off the air completely yesterday when Tom Bradley tried to interview them for his morning show. They stopped before a heavy wooden door fitted with a new deadbolt." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "For their protection," Henderson said quickly. "Some of the locals have gotten agitated. There's been talk about calling in the state authorities, maybe even federal agencies. People are scared, Dr. Whitmore, when something challenges everything you think you know about the world." "Fear is a natural response," Margaret finished. She'd seen it before, the way ordinary people reacted when confronted with languages that didn't fit their understanding of human communication. During the war, even seasoned intelligence officers had struggled with codes that pushed the boundaries of conventional linguistics. "May I see them?" Henderson unlocked the door and stepped aside. 5 minutes maximum. If you start feeling dizzy or nauseous, leave immediately. Dr. Collins from Portland ignored that advice and ended up unconscious for 3 hours. Margaret entered a room that had once been someone's living space. Faded wallpaper, a stone fireplace, wooden furniture that belonged to a simpler time. 3 young women sat near the window, their backs to the door, looking out at the fog-shrouded forest. They wore donated clothing that hung loose on their thin frames, and their dark hair fell in tangled waves past their shoulders. Then they turned, and Margaret's breath caught. Their faces were human enough. Sharp cheekbones, pale skin, eyes that might have been brown or green in different light. But there was something in their expressions that seemed to look through her rather than at her, as if she were simply another piece of furniture in an irrelevant room. The eldest opened her mouth and spoke. The sound hit Margaret like a physical force, a cascading sequence of tones that seemed to bypass her ears and resonate directly in her skull. Mathematical progressions spiraled through harmonics that shouldn't have been possible, frequencies layering upon each other in patterns that her trained mind automatically began analyzing even as her vision blurred. She heard prime numbers encoded in pitch variations, geometric sequences woven through vowel structures that had no equivalent in any terrestrial language. The middle sister joined in, adding counterpoint melodies that created interference patterns in the air itself. Margaret could see them somehow as shimmering distortions that made the room's edges seem unstable. The youngest sister's contribution sent ice through Margaret's veins. Her voice carried undertones so low they were felt rather than heard, vibrations that seemed to reach down into the earth itself and pull up resonances from the bedrock beneath Millfield. But what terrified Margaret most was the recognition that crept through her migraine-addled consciousness. The patterns were familiar, not the specific sequences. She'd never heard these exact combinations before, but the underlying mathematical structure. She'd encountered something similar in the deepest, most classified transmissions she'd worked on during the war. Transmissions that had never been successfully decoded. Transmissions that had originated from coordinates that officially didn't exist. Henderson's hand on her shoulder broke the spell. "Dr. Whitmore, you need to leave, now." She stumbled backward, her equipment case forgotten, as the three sisters continued their impossible conversation. In the hallway, leaning against the wall while the world slowly stopped spinning, Margaret realized she was crying. She'd found them again. The voices that had haunted her dreams for 20 years. Or perhaps they had finally found her. Henderson pressed a glass of water into Margaret's trembling hands, his own steadiness a sharp contrast to the chaos still echoing in her skull. The hallway felt impossibly narrow, the walls seeming to pulse with residual vibrations from whatever the sisters had been communicating. "You recognize something," he said. It wasn't a question. Margaret's throat felt raw, though she hadn't spoken. She managed a sip of water before trusting her voice. "I need to make some calls. Is there somewhere I can work privately?" "My office upstairs. But Dr. Whitmore, perhaps you should rest first. You've gone quite pale." She was already moving toward the stairs, driven by an urgency she couldn't name. "How long until the next bus to Portland?" "Not until Thursday. This isn't exactly a major transit hub." Henderson followed her up the creaking steps. "There's a boarding house on Elm Street if you need accommodation." Margaret paused at the landing, considering. She'd planned to observe the sisters, take some preliminary recordings, and return to Stanford by Friday for her advanced syntax seminar. Her students would be presenting their midterm projects on Monday. The department faculty meeting was scheduled for Tuesday, where they'd discuss her application for tenure track, a promotion she'd been working toward for 8 years. But those mathematical progressions, the impossible harmonics that had made her equipment malfunction just by proximity. "I'll need to stay longer," she heard herself say. Henderson's office was a cluttered shrine to rural medicine. Medical journals stacked on every surface, prescription pads scattered across an oak desk that had probably served 3 generations of country doctors. Margaret set down her equipment case and immediately reached for the black rotary phone. The operator connected her to Stanford after several attempts. Static filled the line. More electromagnetic interference, she suspected. "Linguistics department, this is Helen." "Helen, it's Margaret Whitmore. I need you to transfer me to Professor Carson, please." While she waited, Margaret found herself staring out the office window at the forest beyond Millfield's borders. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their tops lost in fog that seemed to move with purpose rather than wind patterns. Somewhere in those depths, the sisters had emerged. From where? And why now? "Margaret?" Carson's voice crackled through the static. "I thought you were chasing some rural folklore nonsense in Oregon." "James, I need to extend my research trip. Can you cover my Friday seminar?" A pause. "Margaret, you know I support your work, but the tenure committee is meeting next week. Hoffman's already questioning your absence from departmental obligations." "Professor Hoffman." Margaret closed her eyes, seeing his perpetually disapproving expression, the way he'd questioned her war work during her job interview. Unconventional background for an academic position, he'd called it. The implication had been clear. Her government service was viewed as a mark against her scholarly credentials rather than an asset. "This could be significant, James. I'm encountering linguistic patterns that challenge our fundamental understanding of human vocal communication." "That's what you said about the Basque dialects last year, and the Aboriginal songlines the year before." Carson's tone softened slightly. "Look, I know you're brilliant, but you can't keep chasing ghosts from the war. It's affecting your academic focus." Margaret felt the familiar tightness in her chest. Carson meant well. They'd been colleagues for 6 years, had even briefly dated until she'd ended it, rather than explain why she woke up screaming some nights. But he couldn't understand. None of them could. They'd never sat in underground rooms listening to enemy transmissions that defied every principle of human language, never felt the weight of knowing that failed translations meant dead soldiers. 3 days, she said. Give me 3 days to document what I'm finding here. The tenure committee will have to decide based on my published work and teaching record. Margaret surprised herself with the steel in her voice. If they can't see past one extended research trip, then maybe Stanford isn't where I belong. She hung up before Carson could respond, immediately regretting the words. Stanford was where she belonged. The structured environment, predictable routines, students who looked at her with respect rather than suspicion. Her small faculty apartment with its carefully organized bookshelves and the coffee shop on campus, where she graded papers every Tuesday evening. The life she'd built was ordinary, safe, controllable. Everything the war years hadn't been. Margaret dialed the boarding house number Henderson had written on a prescription pad. Mrs. Kowalski had a room available, second floor, $25 for the week. As she arranged her temporary accommodation, Margaret caught her reflection in the office window. At 42, she looked older than her years, premature silver threading through brown hair, lines around her eyes from squinting at coded transmissions under inadequate lighting. She'd sacrificed much for her academic career, had deliberately chosen intellectual puzzles over personal relationships, professional recognition over the messy complications of family life. But those voices downstairs, carrying mathematical structures that shouldn't exist, they might cost her everything she'd worked to build. Yet walking away felt impossible. Some puzzles, Margaret realized, chose their solvers rather than the other way around. Margaret had just hung up the phone when the sound reached them. It started as a low hum that seemed to rise from the building's foundation itself, vibrating through the wooden floors and into her bones. Henderson's coffee cup rattled against its saucer. The medical journals scattered across his desk began sliding toward the edges, as if the room had tilted imperceptibly. Then the sisters' voices joined the frequency. Even through the heavy door and thick walls, their harmonics cut through the building's structure like tuning forks striking crystal. Margaret felt her teeth ache as the mathematical progressions climbed impossible scales, each note precisely calculated to resonate with something far beyond human hearing range. Henderson grabbed her arm. This is new. They've never done this before. The overhead light fixture swayed, its bulb flickering in patterns that matched the vocal rhythms from below. Margaret's equipment case fell open, spilling her recording devices across the floor. The electromagnetic interference was so strong that her magnetic tape reels began spinning on their own, producing feedback squeals that added to the cacophony. "We need to get down there," Margaret said, though every instinct screamed the opposite. During the war, she'd learned to trust those moments when ordinary caution had to give way to professional necessity. Some discoveries could only be made by walking directly into danger. Henderson was already moving toward the stairs. Mrs. Patterson was supposed to check on them at 2 o'clock, if she was in the room when this started. They found the elderly volunteer unconscious on the clinic's main floor, her body convulsing in rhythm with the impossible frequencies pouring from the sister's room. Henderson immediately knelt beside her, checking her pulse while Margaret approached the heavy wooden door. The deadbolt had been thrown from the inside. "That's not possible," Henderson called over the escalating harmonics. "There's no interior lock mechanism. I had it specially installed to only work from this side." Margaret pressed her ear to the door. The sisters' voices had synchronized into a single, complex waveform that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Her trained ear caught fragments of the mathematical structures she'd recognized earlier, but now they were amplified, refined, building towards something that felt like a linguistic crescendo. Then she heard the response. It came from outside, beyond the fog-shrouded forest, a sound so vast and low that it registered more as earthquake than voice. The building's windows rattled in their frames, car alarms began wailing throughout Millfield, and beneath it all, Margaret detected patterns, rhythmic pulses that answered the sisters' transmissions with mathematical precision. Something was talking back. Henderson had managed to revive Mrs. Patterson, who was babbling about lights in the sky and voices in her head before falling silent again. The old woman's eyes had rolled back, showing only white, but her lips were moving in perfect synchronization with the sisters' impossible language. Margaret felt her academic world crumbling around her, everything she'd built her career upon. Phonetics, syntax, the fundamental principles of human communication was being systematically demolished by whatever was happening in that locked room. But underneath the fear, she felt something else, the electric thrill of recognition that had drawn her to cryptography in the first place. This was bigger than wartime codes, bigger than anything she'd encountered in 20 years of linguistic research. The sisters' voices suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was profound, almost aggressive in its completeness. Even the fog outside seemed to pause, hanging motionless between the trees like a held breath. Margaret's ears rang in the absence of the impossible frequencies. Henderson was on his feet, fumbling for his keys. "I'm calling the state police. This has gone far beyond my capabilities." "No." Margaret surprised herself with the firmness in her voice. "Not yet. Give me one more session with them. Let me document what's happening before we bring in authorities who won't understand. Dr. Whitmore, you saw what just occurred. This isn't linguistics anymore. This is—" Henderson gestured helplessly at Mrs. Patterson's unconscious form, at the scattered medical equipment, at the windows still vibrating with residual energy. "This is something else entirely." Margaret knew he was right. Every rational part of her mind was screaming to pack her equipment and catch the first bus back to Stanford, back to the safety of academic conferences and peer-reviewed journals. She could return to her advanced syntax seminar, pretend she'd never heard those impossible voices, never felt the universe expanding beyond the comfortable boundaries of human knowledge. But the mathematician in her, the part that had spent years unraveling enemy codes that everyone else had deemed impossible, recognized the patterns emerging here. The sisters weren't just speaking an unknown language. They were part of a communication system that spanned distances her mind could barely comprehend. And if she walked away now, if she chose safety over discovery, she might never get another chance to decode the most important message humanity had ever received. 24 hours, she said. Then we call whoever you think we should call. Henderson looked at her for a long moment, then slowly nodded. Some choices, Margaret realized, were really just illusions of choice. The universe had already decided what came next. The boarding house room smelled of old wood and decades of transient occupants, but Margaret barely noticed as she sat on the narrow bed, staring at her hands. They hadn't stopped trembling since she'd left the clinic 3 hours ago. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard those impossible harmonics, felt the way they'd reached inside her skull and rearranged something fundamental. She should call Carson back, tell him she'd made a mistake, that she'd be on the first bus home tomorrow. The tenure committee meeting was in 5 days. If she left now, she could still salvage her academic reputation. Professor Hoffman's disapproval would fade if she published something respectable about regional dialect variations, maybe wrote a paper on the psychological effects of isolation on linguistic development. But that would require lying. It would mean pretending the sisters were suffering from some form of collective psychosis rather than— What? What were they, exactly? Margaret opened her equipment case and stared at the recording devices Henderson had helped her retrieve from his office floor. The magnetic tape in her primary recorder had been completely erased, not damaged, but wiped clean as if it had never contained any sound at all. Her backup unit showed similar electromagnetic scarring. 20 years of fieldwork, and she'd never encountered anything that could eliminate audio traces so thoroughly. During the war, she'd worked with classified transmissions that pushed the boundaries of known physics, radio signals that arrived before they were sent. frequency combinations that shouldn't have been able to propagate through Earth's atmosphere. She'd learned to compartmentalize the impossible aspects, focus on the mathematical structures she could analyze. But this was different. The sisters weren't just using advanced technology, they were doing something that challenged the basic mechanics of human vocal anatomy. A knock at the door interrupted her spiraling thoughts. "Dr. Whitmore? It's Jim Henderson." She opened the door to find the doctor looking as haggard as she felt, his usually neat appearance rumpled and anxious. "Mrs. Patterson is stable, but she's been speaking fragments of what the sisters were saying. Perfect pronunciation of sounds no human throat should be able to produce." Margaret felt ice form in her stomach. "How is that possible?" "I don't know. But there's something else. I've been getting calls from other towns. Cascade Falls, Pine Ridge, 3 settlements further into the mountains. They're reporting similar electromagnetic disturbances, animals acting strangely, people complaining of headaches that started around the same time as our event. How far does the effect extend?" Henderson ran a hand through his grey hair. "At least a 50-mile radius, maybe more. Dr. Whitmore, I think we're dealing with something that requires resources far beyond what a small-town clinic can provide." Margaret sank into the room's single chair, overwhelmed by the implications. If the sisters' communication was affecting such a vast area, then whatever they were transmitting, or receiving, operated on a scale that dwarfed any human technology. The mathematical precision she'd detected suggested intelligence, but intelligence of a type that might not recognize human limitations. "My career will be over," she said quietly. Henderson looked puzzled. "I'm sorry. If I document this honestly, if I publish findings about impossible vocal frequencies and long-range electromagnetic effects, the academic community will destroy me. They'll claim I've suffered a psychological breakdown, that my war work left me prone to paranoid fantasies. I'll lose my position, my research funding, everything I've worked to build." The doctor sat on the edge of the bed, studying her with the kind of attention he probably reserved for diagnosing difficult cases. "But if you don't document it, and this spreads, becomes something larger, then humanity might face a form of contact it's completely unprepared for." Margaret finished the thought he couldn't quite voice. She'd run the calculations during the sleepless hours since leaving the clinic. If the sisters were part of a communication network, if their emergence from the forest wasn't accidental, then everything that followed would depend on how well humans could understand what they were trying to say. "I keep thinking about the war," she admitted. "The transmissions we couldn't decode, the intelligence failures that cost lives. What if I'm being given a second chance? What if this time I can break the code before it's too late?" Henderson was quiet for a long moment. What if it's already too late? What if the sisters aren't the beginning of whatever this is, but the end result? The question hung between them like a physical presence. Margaret had been assuming the sisters were harbingers, advanced scouts for something larger. But what if they were refugees? What if their emergence from the forest, their malnourished appearance, their desperate attempts to communicate represented not invasion but escape? Outside, fog pressed against the boarding house windows with unusual density, blocking even the streetlights from view. Somewhere in that grey void, 3 young women were continuing their impossible conversations, sending signals toward coordinates that human mathematics could barely calculate. Margaret's hands had finally stopped trembling. The fear remained, but underneath it, she recognized the familiar hunger that had driven her through years of cryptographic work. Some puzzles were too important to abandon, regardless of personal cost. Margaret stood and walked to her equipment case, lifting out the damaged recording devices with steady hands. The trembling had stopped, replaced by the familiar clarity that came with irrevocable decisions. She'd felt this moment before, in underground bunkers when choosing to pursue transmissions that other cryptographers had dismissed as atmospheric interference, knowing that each choice carried consequences measured in human lives. "I'm going back to the clinic," she said. "Tonight." Henderson straightened. Dr. Whitmore, after what happened this afternoon. Because of what happened this afternoon. Margaret began packing fresh recording equipment, her movements precise and methodical. Whatever we witnessed was a response to something. The sisters weren't just vocalizing randomly, they were answering. Which means there's a pattern, a structure I can decode if I can get close enough to document it properly. The electromagnetic interference destroyed your equipment. Then I'll use analog methods, shorthand notation, frequency estimation by ear, mathematical modeling on paper. She held up a leather journal and several pencils. I spent 3 years in rural France working with equipment that failed more often than it functioned. This isn't different. But it was different, and they both knew it. The war had been fought between human intelligences, using technologies that stretched but didn't break the laws of physics. What they'd encountered today operated according to rules that human science hadn't yet discovered. Henderson stood, pacing to the window where fog continued its unnatural vigil. The state police won't understand what they're dealing with, neither will the federal authorities when this inevitably escalates. But you might. I might fail completely, decode nothing, understand nothing, and watch whatever's happening continue without any human input. Margaret closed the equipment case with a decisive snap. But I have to try, because if I don't, if I choose academic safety over this opportunity and people die because we couldn't understand what the sisters were trying to tell us, the weight of those unfinished wartime transmissions settled between them again. Messages that might have contained warnings about troop movements, intelligence that could have prevented ambushes, codes that had taken her months to crack, always months too late. Margaret had built her post-war career on the foundation of those failures, driven by the knowledge that every linguistic puzzle potentially carried life or death implications. You're asking me to let you enter that room again, knowing what it did to Mrs. Patterson. I'm asking you to unlock the door and then leave the building. Margaret shouldered her case and picked up her journal. Whatever happens to me is my choice. But someone needs to document what we're witnessing, and I'm the only person in this town with the background to recognize linguistic patterns of this complexity. Henderson was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the dim light filtering through fog-obscured street lamps. Finally, he nodded slowly. My medical oath requires me to prevent harm when possible, but it also requires me to support decisions made by mentally competent patients about their own care. And Dr. Whitmore, despite everything we've witnessed today, you're the most competent person I've met in years. They walked through Millfield's empty streets, their footsteps muffled by fog that seemed to absorb sound rather than simply muffle it. The town felt abandoned, though Margaret could see lights in windows and occasionally heard the distant sound of television broadcasts. The electromagnetic disturbances had created a bubble of isolation around the clinic, a zone where normal human activity became secondary to whatever larger communication was taking place. At the clinic's entrance, Henderson paused with his keys in hand. Once I unlock that door, there's no guarantee I'll be able to get you out safely. The interference patterns seem to be intensifying. Margaret felt the familiar tightness in her chest that had preceded every major decision of her career. The choice to join the war effort despite her family's objections. The decision to pursue academia rather than continue government work. Each moment when safety and discovery stood in opposition, demanding she choose between the life she'd built and the truth she needed to uncover. Dr. Henderson, in your medical opinion, what are the sisters? What are we dealing with? He looked toward the building where impossible voices continued their calculated harmonies. 3 young women who shouldn't be able to produce the sounds they're making, communicating in patterns that affect human neurology across vast distances, responding to signals from sources our instruments can't locate. Henderson met her eyes. They're either the most elaborate hoax in human history, or they're evidence that everything we think we know about our place in the universe is wrong. Margaret nodded and walked toward the clinic door. Behind her, she heard Henderson inserting his key into the lock, the small mechanical sound seeming impossibly loud in the fog-muffled night. Some thresholds, once crossed, eliminated every possibility of return. Margaret had learned that lesson in underground rooms filled with enemy transmissions, and she was about to learn it again. The door opened with a soft click, revealing darkness that hummed with mathematical precision. Margaret stepped across the threshold and immediately understood that the clinic had been transformed into something beyond human architecture. The familiar hallway stretched ahead, but the air itself had become dense with purpose, thrumming with frequencies that made her teeth ache. Behind her, she heard Henderson's sharp intake of breath. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. The walls were covered in symbols. Not carved or painted, but somehow burned into the plaster and wood, mathematical equations and geometric patterns that seemed to shift when viewed peripherally. Margaret recognized fragments, logarithmic spirals, prime number sequences, stellar coordinate systems, but they were woven together in configurations that her academic training couldn't pass. The symbols glowed faintly, pulsing in rhythm with the sisters' vocalizations emanating from the examination room. "This wasn't here this afternoon," Henderson said, his voice tight with disbelief. Margaret approached the nearest wall, studying symbols that hurt to look at directly. They were precise, elegant, and utterly alien in their mathematical sophistication. "They're teaching us," she murmured. "Or trying to. This is a primer, basic concepts we need to understand before we can decode their actual communications." A new voice joined the sisters' harmonies, deeper, older, unmistakably male. Margaret's blood froze as she recognized the timbre, Thomas Dalton, the father who'd been missing for 3 weeks. But the sound emerging from the examination room wasn't human speech corrupted by whatever had changed the sisters. It was something that had never been human at all, using Thomas Dalton's vocal apparatus to produce frequencies that made the building's foundation vibrate. "We need to leave," Henderson said, backing toward the entrance. Margaret ignored him, pulling out her journal and beginning to sketch the wall symbols. Her hand moved independently of conscious thought, guided by pattern recognition skills honed during years of cryptographic work. The equations weren't random. They built upon each other, creating a mathematical framework that seemed designed to expand human understanding by careful degrees. "Dr. Whitmore, whatever's in that room isn't the family we admitted yesterday." "No," Margaret agreed, not looking up from her frantic documentation. "But it's using their forms to communicate concepts we couldn't otherwise comprehend. Look at this sequence." She pointed to a spiral of numbers that seemed to rotate despite being static marks on plaster. "It's a star chart, but showing positions across time, stellar movements spanning millennia. They're trying to show us where they came from." The voices from the examination room shifted, taking on harmonics that made the air shimmer with visible distortions. Margaret felt something touch her mind, not invasive, but tentative, like a vast intelligence carefully testing whether human consciousness could withstand direct contact. Images flashed behind her eyes, vast distances between stars, civilizations that rose and fell while light crawled across galactic emptiness. Intelligence that had learned to encode itself in mathematics precise enough to survive the journey between worlds. "They're refugees," she gasped, understanding flooding through her with painful clarity. Something destroyed their home system. "They've been traveling for centuries. The sisters aren't invaded or possessed. They're hosting something that has nowhere else to go." Henderson grabbed her shoulder. "We have to call the authorities, the military. Someone equipped to handle this." Margaret shook him off, continuing to document symbols that seemed to multiply even as she watched. "The military will see this as a threat to be neutralized. They'll kill the only form of communication we have with intelligence that survived interstellar travel. We need linguists, mathematicians, people who understand that this might be the most important conversation in human history." But even as she spoke, Margaret could hear new sounds from outside, vehicles approaching through the fog, radio chatter, the organized movement of people who detected something beyond normal parameters. The electromagnetic disturbances had apparently triggered monitoring systems she hadn't known existed, automated protocols that brought armed response to unexplained phenomena. "Time's running out," she said, sketching faster, trying to capture as much of the mathematical framework as possible before official intervention ended any possibility of peaceful contact. The examination room door opened without anyone touching it. The Dalton sisters stood in the doorway, but their eyes now held depths that spoke of vast distances and impossible loneliness. Behind them, the shape that had once been Thomas Dalton regarded Margaret with expression that conveyed both gratitude and desperate urgency. When they spoke, their voices layered into harmonics that bypassed her ears entirely, communicating directly with the pattern recognition centers of her brain. Margaret understood, finally, why her equipment had failed. The communication wasn't acoustic, it was mathematical, ideas transmitted through precisely modulated electromagnetic fields that human nervous systems could interpret, but human technology couldn't record. She was experiencing the universe's most sophisticated form of language, designed to bridge the gap between radically different forms of consciousness. Outside, military vehicles were surrounding the building. Soon, this opportunity would be lost forever, reduced to classified files and weapons research. Margaret looked at the beings who had once been the Dalton family, raised her journal, and began speaking mathematics. Margaret began with basic arithmetic, speaking numbers aloud while sketching corresponding equations in her journal, holding it toward the beings so they could see her attempts at mathematical communication. The response was immediate. The wall symbols pulsed brighter, reorganizing themselves into simpler configurations that matched her elementary approach. 2 + 2 = 4, she said clearly, then moved to multiplication tables, geometric principles, anything that might establish a foundation for more complex exchange. The eldest sister stepped forward, and when she spoke, Margaret's mind translated the harmonic frequencies into pure mathematical concepts, confirmation, encouragement, and something that felt unmistakably like relief. Henderson pressed himself against the corridor wall, watching military personnel take positions outside the fog-shrouded windows. "Dr. Whitmore, they're surrounding the building. We have maybe 5 minutes before they breach the doors." But Margaret was lost in the most extraordinary conversation of her life. The beings were teaching her their mathematical framework at accelerated speed, downloading concepts directly into her consciousness while she struggled to document what she could absorb. Star charts flowed through her awareness, showing not just spatial coordinates, but temporal ones, the journey they'd made across centuries of space-time, seeking worlds where their form of consciousness could find refuge. Thomas Dalton's shape moved closer, and Margaret felt his attention focus on her with uncomfortable intensity. When he communicated, the message carried layers of meaning that made her head throb. They hadn't chosen this world randomly. Earth's electromagnetic field, its particular combination of atmospheric gases, the specific neural structure of human consciousness, all of it matched parameters they'd been searching for across vast galactic distances. "You're dying," Margaret whispered, understanding flooding through her as she processed their increasingly desperate transmissions. "Your host bodies can't sustain your consciousness for much longer." The confirmation came as a wave of sorrow so profound that Margaret gasped aloud. The Dalton family had already been dead when the entities found them in the forest, exposure and hypothermia claiming them during their final camping trip. What she was communicating with now were alien consciousnesses animating corpses through pure electromagnetic manipulation, buying themselves enough time to find a more permanent solution. "The countdown," she said, remembering the temporal sequences she'd detected earlier. "You're not preparing to call your people home. You're calculating how long you have before these bodies completely decay." Outside, amplified voices were demanding surrender, ordering the building's occupants to exit with hands visible. Margaret heard Henderson speaking urgently into his radio, trying to explain that they were dealing with a medical situation rather than a security threat. But the electromagnetic interference was disrupting communications, turning his words into static that only increased military suspicions. The youngest sister approached Margaret's position. her movements exhibiting the careful precision of someone learning to operate unfamiliar machinery. When she attempted communication, the message came through broken and fragmented, other sites, other contact points, a network of similar encounters across continents that human governments were moving to suppress with lethal force. Margaret's blood went cold as she processed the implications. The entities weren't isolated refugees, they were scattered survivors of something catastrophic, landing at multiple points across Earth's surface and attempting to establish communication before their temporary host bodies failed. But human authorities were responding to each contact point as an invasion threat, systematically destroying the only chances these beings had for survival. "Dr. Henderson," she called over her shoulder, "how many other towns reported electromagnetic disturbances? How many places are experiencing symptoms similar to what we've seen here?" "Dozens. Maybe more. The phenomena seem to be spreading along the entire Cascade Range and beyond." Henderson's voice carried new understanding and horror. "Oh God, they're killing them, aren't they? Every site that shows unexplained activity is getting the same military response we're about to receive." The wall symbols were changing again, becoming more urgent, showing Margaret mathematical frameworks she couldn't fully comprehend, but recognized as desperate contingency plans. The entities were trying to teach her enough of their communication methods that she might serve as an interpreter, a bridge between their consciousness and human authority. But time was running out, and her human neurology was already straining under the cognitive load. Margaret felt something warm running from her nose. Blood, she realized, the same symptom Mrs. Patterson had experienced. Direct neural interface with alien consciousness was damaging her brain at the cellular level. She might have minutes before the contact permanently impaired her ability to think clearly. The military was breaching the clinic's rear entrance, tactical teams moving through rooms they assumed contained enemy combatants. Soon they would reach the corridor where Margaret stood between human firepower and the universe's last desperate attempt at peaceful first contact. She looked at the beings inhabiting the Dalton family's corpses, raised her journal one final time, and began speaking the most complex mathematical concepts she could formulate, praying that somewhere in her academic vocabulary lay the key to preventing interstellar genocide. The entity's response came as pure gratitude mixed with fading hope, and Margaret realized she was about to become humanity's most important translator, or its final failure. The tactical team's boots thundered through the clinic's rear corridors, their radio chatter crackling through electromagnetic interference that turned urgent commands into incomprehensible static. Margaret wiped blood from her nose with a trembling hand, her vision blurring as alien mathematics burned through neural pathways never designed to process such complexity. "Listen to me," she whispered desperately to the beings before her, her voice barely audible over the approaching chaos. "I understand what you're trying to tell me, but I can't hold this much information. My brain is literally breaking down." The Thomas Dalton entity stepped closer, its borrowed features expressing an emotion she couldn't name. When it communicated, the message bypassed her failing auditory processing entirely, downloading directly into her consciousness. They needed her to survive long enough to explain their nature to human authority. Every other contact point had ended in destruction because no one could bridge the gap between their mathematical language and human comprehension. Margaret's journal fell from her hands as her motor control began to deteriorate. The blood flowing from her nose was increasing, and she could taste copper in her mouth. The same neural damage that had claimed Mrs. Patterson was accelerating. Direct interface with alien consciousness was never meant to be sustained by human neurology. "Dr. Whitmore," Henderson's voice cut through the mathematical harmonies filling the corridor. "Military's at the main entrance. They're demanding immediate surrender of all building occupants." The eldest sister moved toward Margaret with mechanical precision, her reanimated form beginning to show signs of advanced decay. When she spoke, Margaret's failing translation ability caught fragments of desperate urgency. Other survivors scattered across continents, each group holding pieces of vital information, all of them dying as their temporary host bodies broke down. Without successful communication at this site, the entire refugee population would be lost. Margaret forced herself to focus despite the agony splitting her skull. Everything she'd learned about cryptography and linguistics had led to this moment, not decoding enemy transmissions to save Allied soldiers, but translating alien desperation to prevent humanity from committing genocide through ignorance. The patterns were there, encoded in mathematical structures too complex for human consciousness to fully grasp, but she could approximate enough to serve as an interpreter. "Henderson," she called out, her voice slurring as cognitive function deteriorated. "Get on your radio. Tell them we have refugees, not invaders. Tell them the electromagnetic interference is communication, not weapons preparation. The radio's completely dead. Too much interference." The tactical team reached the main corridor. Margaret heard their shocked exclamations as they encountered the wall symbols, their training inadequate for phenomena beyond conventional threat assessment. Through her fading awareness, she felt the aliens' terror as armed humans approached with weapons drawn. The youngest entity, barely holding together the corpse of a 16-year-old girl, attempted direct communication with the tactical team leader. Margaret watched in horror as the soldier's eyes rolled back, blood streaming from his nose and ears as his unprotected mind tried to process alien mathematics. He collapsed, convulsing, his nervous system overwhelmed by contact he couldn't interpret. The remaining soldiers opened fire. Bullets passed harmlessly through the electromagnetic fields maintaining the entity's consciousness, but the Dalton bodies jerked and danced under the assault, precious animation systems disrupted by physical trauma to their host forms. Margaret screamed, partly from witnessing the slaughter, partly from the feedback as alien panic flooded through her compromised neural interface. "Stop! They're trying to communicate!" she shouted, but her words were lost in gunfire and shouted commands. The wall symbols blazed with desperate intensity as the entities poured their remaining energy into a final transmission. Margaret felt her consciousness expand beyond sustainable limits as they downloaded everything they could: star charts, refugee locations, the mathematical framework for interspecies communication, the desperate hope that somehow this information might reach humans capable of understanding. Her brain was burning from the inside. She could feel neurons dying under the cognitive load, synapses overloading as alien knowledge carved itself into human neural architecture never designed to contain such complexity. But she forced herself to remain conscious, to serve as witness to humanity's first contact with intelligence from beyond Earth. The Thomas entity approached her as its host body collapsed, bullet wounds disrupting the electromagnetic patterns holding its consciousness in place. Its final communication hit Margaret with shattering force. They had traveled across centuries of space seeking refuge, had found a world capable of hosting their mathematical form of consciousness, had attempted peaceful contact through the only means available to beings without physical form, and humanity had responded with immediate lethal force. Margaret collapsed as the last alien presence faded from the clinic, leaving behind only human corpses and wall symbols that would soon be classified beyond any civilian access. Blood pooled beneath her head as her damaged brain struggled to process what she'd witnessed. In her fading awareness, she felt the weight of absolute failure, not just personal failure, but species-level failure to recognize intelligence when it reached desperately across the void seeking sanctuary. The tactical team leader called for medical evacuation, but Margaret knew the damage went far beyond what human medicine could repair. She had become humanity's translator for the universe's most important conversation, and she had failed to prevent an act of cosmic murder. Everything she'd learned had been tested in those final moments, and it hadn't been enough. The medical evacuation helicopter's rotors cut through Millfield's perpetual fog as Margaret drifted in and out of consciousness on the clinic floor. Each time awareness returned, she found herself staring at the wall where alien mathematics had blazed with desperate intelligence only hours before. Now the symbols were fading, their luminescent urgency dimming to barely visible scratches that military photographers were documenting before the surfaces were scrubbed clean. Neural trauma consistent with severe electromagnetic exposure, she heard the medic report into his radio. Patient shows signs of stroke-like damage, but the patterns don't match any known medical condition. Margaret tried to speak, to explain that the damage came from her brain attempting to process information structures beyond human cognitive capacity, but her words emerged as meaningless sounds. The alien mathematics had burned pathways through her consciousness that would never heal properly. She was losing the ability to translate even her own thoughts into coherent speech. Dr. Henderson knelt beside her stretcher, his face pale with shock and guilt. "Margaret, can you hear me? The military is classifying everything. They're saying this was a biological weapons test, some kind of Soviet experiment that went wrong. No one's going to know what really happened here." She wanted to grab him, to make him understand that the universe had just become a lonelier place through humanity's failure to recognize intelligence when it reached across the void seeking help. But her hands wouldn't obey her commands. The neural pathways controlling motor function had been damaged beyond repair during those final moments of contact. Through the clinic's shattered windows, Margaret could see military personnel loading the Dalton family's bodies into sealed containers. The corpses showed extensive bullet damage, but she knew the real tragedy was invisible. 3 desperate alien consciousnesses had died with their host forms, their final hopes for survival extinguished by human fear and misunderstanding. The medic was checking her pupils with a flashlight, but Margaret's attention was fixed on something else. In her peripheral vision, she could still see traces of the mathematical framework the entities had downloaded into her consciousness during their death throes. Star charts showing refugee locations across continents, electromagnetic frequencies that could facilitate communication with intelligence beyond Earth, the complete linguistic key to understanding how mathematical consciousness could interface with physical reality. All of it was locked inside her damaged brain, inaccessible because the same neural trauma that had allowed her to receive the information now prevented her from retrieving or sharing it. "We need to get her to a neurological facility," the medic was saying. "This level of brain damage, she may never recover normal speech or motor function." Henderson leaned closer, his voice urgent but gentle. "Margaret, your research notes, your journal, everything got destroyed in the electromagnetic surge. There's no record of your translation work, no documentation of what you discovered about their language." The full scope of her failure crashed through Margaret's fading awareness. Not only had she failed to prevent the slaughter of Earth's first alien visitors, but she'd also lost every piece of evidence that might help humanity recognize and properly respond to future contact. Her life's work in linguistics, her desperate attempts to decode the entity's mathematical language, her careful documentation of their peaceful intentions, all of it had been erased along with her ability to communicate effectively. As they lifted her stretcher toward the waiting helicopter, Margaret caught a glimpse of the forest where the Dalton sisters had first emerged. Somewhere among those fog-shrouded trees lay the original landing site, the place where alien refugees had made their first tentative contact with Earth. Military units were already mobilizing toward those coordinates, prepared to sterilize any remaining evidence of extraterrestrial presence. The helicopter's engines roared to life, drowning out the radio chatter, coordinating what the tactical team leader was calling biocontainment protocols. Margaret realized with crystalline clarity that humanity's first contact with alien intelligence would be recorded in classified files as a successful neutralization of foreign biological weapons. The truth would disappear into government archives where it could never interfere with official narratives about Earth's place in the universe. Through her damaged consciousness, Margaret felt the weight of cosmic loneliness settling over the world like a shroud. The entities had spoken of other refugee groups scattered across continents, all of them seeking peaceful contact while their temporary host bodies failed. By now, military responses similar to Millfield's were probably playing out at dozens of locations. each one ending in the same tragic misunderstanding. As the helicopter lifted off, carrying her toward a future of speechless isolation, Margaret understood that she had become the sole keeper of humanity's most important secret. The mathematical framework for interspecies communication remained locked in her brain, but her damaged neural pathways would never again allow her to share what she knew. The universe had tried to speak to humanity, and Margaret Whitmore, linguist, codebreaker, humanity's chosen translator, had failed so completely that even her failure would remain forever classified, buried alongside the corpses of Earth's first alien refugees. The helicopter's cabin vibrated with mechanical rhythm as Margaret stared through the small window at Millfield, disappearing into Oregon's endless fog. Her damaged mind struggled to process the catastrophic failure she'd witnessed, but something else was happening. Something the medical team couldn't detect or understand. The alien mathematics weren't simply locked away in her brain, they were alive. As the aircraft climbed through cloud cover, Margaret felt the downloaded information reorganizing itself, adapting to her neural architecture like a symbiotic organism learning to survive in an incompatible host. The star charts weren't just data anymore, they were becoming part of her consciousness, integrating with her memories of childhood stargazing, her academic knowledge of astronomy, her lifelong fascination with patterns hidden in apparent chaos. Patients showing unusual brainwave activity, the medic reported into his headset. Electromagnetic readings are off the charts, but she seems to be stabilizing. Margaret wanted to laugh, but her damaged vocal cords produced only a rasping sound. Stabilizing. If only they knew that her consciousness was being fundamentally rewritten by alien intelligence that had sacrificed its last reserves of energy to preserve humanity's only hope for future contact. Through her peripheral vision, she could see Henderson in the helicopter's jump seat, his face etched with guilt and confusion. He thought he was witnessing the tragic end of a brilliant career, a linguist broken by exposure to phenomena beyond human comprehension. He couldn't see what was really happening. Margaret Whitmore was evolving into something unprecedented, a hybrid consciousness capable of bridging the gap between human and alien thought. The revelation struck her with devastating clarity. The entities hadn't been trying to use her as a translator during those final moments. They'd been transforming her into one. Her years of linguistic training, her obsession with mathematical patterns in language, her guilt over failing to decode wartime transmissions, everything had prepared her for this moment. The aliens had recognized something in her consciousness that even she hadn't understood, the capacity to become a living repository for interspecies communication protocols. Margaret closed her eyes and felt the full scope of what now existed within her mind. Star charts showing not just refugee locations, but the coordinates of their origin point. A dying world where mathematical consciousness had evolved beyond the need for physical form, only to face extinction as their reality collapsed into entropy. They were the survivors, fleeing across impossible distances in search of compatible dimensions where their thought patterns could find temporary sanctuary. Earth hadn't been invaded, it had been chosen as a refugee camp for the universe's most advanced civilization, and humanity had responded with immediate, lethal force. But the entities had anticipated this possibility. Their final act hadn't been random desperation, it had been a carefully planned contingency. They'd identified Margaret as someone whose consciousness could be modified to serve as a bridge between species, a living translation matrix that could prevent future contact from ending in slaughter. The helicopter banked toward a military medical facility, and Margaret felt new awareness flooding through her rewired neural pathways. She could sense electromagnetic fields with the same clarity she'd once applied to analyzing phonetic structures. The pilot's radio communications weren't just human voices anymore, they were mathematical patterns she could decode and manipulate. For the first time since the clinic assault, Margaret attempted to speak. What emerged wasn't the damaged stammering the medical team expected, but a low harmonic that made the helicopter's instruments flicker. The medic looked up sharply from his clipboard, but Margaret had already fallen silent, testing the limits of her transformation. She understood now why her academic career had been marked by frustration and failure. Her consciousness had been preparing for this moment, not to serve human linguistic research, but to become humanity's first truly bilingual citizen, fluent in both terrestrial language and the mathematical communications of species that had transcended physical existence. The weight of responsibility settled over her like a shroud. Somewhere across Earth's continents, other refugee groups were dying as military forces eliminated what they perceived as biological threats. But Margaret now carried within her consciousness the protocols necessary to prevent future contact from ending in genocide. The aliens had given her the mathematical frameworks for peaceful first contact, the electromagnetic frequencies that could convey peaceful intent, the cognitive structures necessary for humans to communicate with intelligence beyond their evolutionary experience. She was no longer Margaret Whitmore, failed linguistics professor haunted by wartime guilt. She had become something unprecedented, humanity's first ambassador to the universe, carrying within her damaged brain the keys to interspecies communication. But she was also the sole witness to humanity's cosmic crime, and the only being on Earth who understood that the universe had just become infinitely lonelier through her species' failure to recognize intelligence when it reached desperately across the void seeking sanctuary. As the helicopter descended toward the medical facility where she would spend the rest of her life in classified isolation, Margaret felt the full burden of her transformation settling into place. She had gained the power to prevent future slaughter, but lost the ability to convince anyone she wasn't simply brain-damaged and delusional. The universe had made her its translator, and her first assignment was learning to live with the weight of secrets too vast for human comprehension. The medical facility materialized through the helicopter's windows like a concrete fortress against the November sky. All sterile angles and reinforced glass, built to contain rather than heal. As the aircraft settled onto the landing pad, Margaret felt the alien mathematics stirring more actively in her consciousness, responding to the electromagnetic fields of the hospital's equipment like a tuning fork finding its frequency. Two orderlies wheeled a gurney toward the helicopter, followed by a woman in a white coat whose purposeful stride suggested military medical training. Margaret watched through damaged eyes as they approached, but her attention was focused inward on the remarkable transformation still occurring within her neural pathways. The star charts weren't just stabilizing, they were teaching her to navigate them. With each passing hour, her hybrid consciousness grew more adept at processing the mathematical language the entities had died to preserve. She could feel herself learning to think in frequencies that existed beyond human sensory experience, to perceive patterns that operated according to cosmic rather than terrestrial logic. Dr. Whitmore? The military physician leaned over the stretcher as they transferred her from the helicopter. I'm Colonel Morrison. We're going to take excellent care of you. Margaret tried to respond and felt a moment of panic when only meaningless sounds emerged. But then the alien protocols activated, analyzing the woman's vocal patterns, her electromagnetic signature, the mathematical structures underlying her speech. Within seconds, Margaret understood not just the words, but the deception beneath them. This wasn't a hospital. It was a research facility designed to study anomalous neural conditions. They were going to experiment on her. The realization triggered something unexpected: resistance. The alien consciousness fragments within her mind began coordinating, not as foreign invaders, but as protective allies. They had sacrificed everything to preserve the possibility of peaceful contact, and they wouldn't allow their living repository to be destroyed by human ignorance. As the medical team wheeled her through sterile corridors lined with electromagnetic monitoring equipment, Margaret felt her transformed consciousness adapting to the facility's systems. Every piece of electronic equipment they passed revealed its operational frequencies to her enhanced perception. The cardiac monitors, the brainwave scanners, the classified recording devices hidden within seemingly innocuous light fixtures, all of it became as readable as printed text. Preliminary scans show extensive neural damage, Colonel Morrison was explaining to her staff. "But the electromagnetic patterns are unlike anything in our database. We'll need to isolate her completely until we understand the transmission mechanism." Margaret wanted to laugh at the cosmic irony. They thought she was the victim of an attack, not realizing she'd become humanity's greatest evolutionary leap forward. The entities hadn't damaged her brain. They'd upgraded it beyond current human capacity for comprehension. In her private room on the facility's secure floor, Margaret finally had space to explore the full scope of her transformation. As orderlies attached monitoring equipment to her unresponsive body, she discovered she could perceive their electronic signals with perfect clarity. More importantly, she could influence them. A gentle pulse of electromagnetic intention, and the cardiac monitor began displaying false readings indicating stable, normal function. Another carefully modulated frequency, and the brainwave scanner showed the neural patterns of someone recovering naturally from stroke-like trauma. Within an hour, Margaret had convinced the monitoring systems that she was healing according to predictable medical trajectories. The truth was far more extraordinary. Her consciousness was expanding into territories that human neurology had never charted. She could feel the alien refugees' desperation echoing across electromagnetic spectrums, their final messages still reverberating through dimensional frequencies that most humans couldn't even theoretically detect. But she could do more than detect them now. She could respond. That first night in the facility, as Colonel Morrison's team reviewed her fabricated medical data, Margaret began reaching out. Her transformed consciousness extended beyond the confines of her damaged body, searching for the electromagnetic signatures of other refugee groups the entities had mentioned during their final transmission. She found them. Scattered across 3 continents, alien consciousnesses were fighting for survival in failing host bodies while military forces converged on their locations. But now they had something they'd lacked in Millfield, a translator who could bridge the gap between species. Margaret's first contact was tentative, a mathematical whisper across impossible distances to a refugee group hiding in the Amazon rainforest. Their response flooded her consciousness with desperate gratitude. They had been preparing for death, their temporary host forms failing as human search teams closed in around their position. Working through the night while her monitoring equipment reported peaceful sleep, Margaret began coordinating humanity's first interspecies rescue operation. She transmitted the electromagnetic frequencies for peaceful contact, the mathematical frameworks for non-threatening communication, the precise cognitive protocols necessary for limited human-alien interface without neural damage. By dawn, she had established communication networks with 7 refugee groups and provided them with the tools for survival. More importantly, she had begun teaching them to modify their approach to human contact, to communicate in ways that wouldn't trigger the fear responses that had led to slaughter in Millfield. As morning light filtered through her secure room's reinforced windows, Margaret Whitmore understood that her real work was just beginning. The universe had made her its ambassador, and she intended to prove worthy of that impossible responsibility. The morning brought Colonel Morrison's research team like clockwork, 4 specialists in radiation exposure, neural trauma, and what they euphemistically termed anomalous linguistic disorders. Margaret lay motionless as they reviewed her fabricated vital signs, discussing her case in clinical terms that revealed their complete ignorance of what had actually occurred in Millfield. "The electromagnetic readings have normalized," Dr. Chen reported, studying her brainwave patterns. "Whatever caused the initial neural disruption appears to be resolving naturally." Margaret suppressed the urge to demonstrate just how resolved her condition had become. Through the facility's electronic networks, she could sense military communications coordinating operations against 3 more refugee sites. The Amazon group she'd contacted was already implementing her survival protocols, but others remained vulnerable. Time was running short. She needed to leave this place. The alien mathematics provided the solution with elegant simplicity. Over the next 48 hours, Margaret orchestrated her own medical miracle. Her fabricated recovery accelerated beyond normal parameters but remained within the realm of medical possibility. The monitoring equipment reported steady improvement in neural function, motor control, and cognitive responses. She began responding to simple commands, then speaking in halting syllables that convinced the medical team her language centers were slowly regenerating. "It's remarkable," Colonel Morrison confided to her staff during their daily review. "Complete recovery from this type of electromagnetic trauma should be impossible, but all indicators suggest she's regaining full function." What they couldn't detect was that Margaret's consciousness now operated across multiple dimensional frequencies simultaneously. While her human personality engaged in rehabilitation exercises, her transformed awareness coordinated rescue operations spanning continents. She taught refugee groups to camouflage their electromagnetic signatures, to communicate through mathematical patterns that wouldn't register on human detection equipment, to survive in temporary host forms until more permanent sanctuary could be arranged. But survival wasn't enough. Margaret had begun to understand the full scope of her responsibility. The entity's final transmission hadn't just been about preserving individual refugee groups. It had contained protocols for something far more significant. Deep within the alien mathematics, Margaret discovered construction blueprints for what could only be described as a dimensional gateway. The refugees weren't meant to hide on Earth indefinitely. They were meant to establish a permanent embassy. The revelation changed everything. She wasn't just coordinating a rescue operation. She was laying the groundwork for humanity's formal entry into a galactic community that had been observing Earth for centuries. The refugee crisis had been a test, and humanity had failed catastrophically. But the entities had provided a second chance through her transformation. Margaret realized she had to return to Millfield. The electromagnetic anomalies there weren't dissipating, as the military reports claimed. The entity's original landing site remained active, its dimensional frequencies resonating with mathematical patterns that could serve as an anchor point for the gateway construction. But the site was under heavy military surveillance, classified as a biological hazard zone that would remain sealed indefinitely. On her fourth day in the facility, Margaret made her choice. During the evening shift change, when electronic monitoring was at its lightest, she implemented the protocols the aliens had died to preserve. Her consciousness expanded beyond her physical form, reaching out through the facility's network infrastructure. Every computer, every monitoring device, every security camera became an extension of her awareness. She triggered carefully orchestrated system failures that would mask her departure while leaving no evidence of sabotage. As emergency lighting flickered on and backup generators hummed to life, Margaret rose from her bed and walked calmly through corridors where automated locks had mysteriously disengaged. Her transformation was complete now. She moved with the fluid certainty of someone who could perceive electromagnetic patterns with the same clarity most people reserved for visible light. The facility's perimeter sensors registered nothing as she crossed the fence line. She had learned to modulate her bioelectric signature to match the background electromagnetic noise that surrounded all human installations. To their equipment, she had become invisible. Standing on a hilltop overlooking the medical facility, Margaret felt the full weight of her cosmic responsibility settling into focus. Behind her lay the remnants of her human life, her academic career, her personal identity, her species-bound limitations. Ahead stretched a future that would redefine humanity's place in the universe. She had to return to Millfield, not as Dr. Margaret Whitmore, disgraced linguistics professor, but as Earth's first interspecies ambassador. The military forces guarding the site would perceive her as a delusional trauma victim seeking closure at the scene of her breakdown. They couldn't imagine she was actually coming home to complete the most important translation work in human history. The alien refugees scattered across Earth were depending on her success. More importantly, the universe itself was watching to see whether humanity deserved a second chance at first contact. Margaret began walking north through Oregon's fog-shrouded mountains, following electromagnetic patterns only she could perceive toward a confrontation that would determine whether Earth remained isolated in cosmic quarantine or finally earned its place among the civilizations that moved freely between dimensions. The real work was just beginning. The journey north through Oregon's wilderness took 3 days, but Margaret experienced time differently now. Her consciousness operated across multiple temporal frequencies simultaneously, her human awareness tracking the physical demands of hiking through mountain terrain, while her transformed perception coordinated with refugee groups operating on accelerated decision-making cycles that compressed hours of planning into minutes of electromagnetic exchange. She followed ley lines of cosmic radiation that crisscrossed the Cascade Mountains like an invisible highway system, each pulse of energy confirming she was moving toward the dimensional anchor point the entities had died to establish. Behind her, military search teams were already mobilizing to track her escape from the medical facility, but their electromagnetic signatures registered on her enhanced awareness like beacon fires against the night sky. She could avoid them indefinitely. More concerning were the communications she intercepted from Millfield itself. Colonel Harrison's containment operation had evolved into something far more ambitious than simple quarantine. They were constructing a research installation directly over the original contact site, apparently convinced that the electromagnetic anomalies represented a new form of energy weapon, rather than the afterglow of interdimensional refugees dying in terror and pain. Margaret felt the alien mathematics surge with protective fury at this revelation. The entity's consciousness fragments within her mind weren't merely passive recordings. They were fully aware presences, and they recognized the profound violation of converting their gravesite into a military laboratory. Their response flooded her awareness with construction protocols for dimensional technology that could level continents if improperly implemented. She forced herself to maintain human perspective amid the alien outrage. The entities had chosen her precisely because she retained the capacity for species loyalty despite her transformation. They needed an ambassador who could balance cosmic responsibility with terrestrial wisdom, not a weapon of revenge. On her final night before reaching Millfield, Margaret made contact with the largest remaining refugee cluster, 47 entities hiding within a Canadian research station in the Arctic. Their host forms were failing rapidly, and human scientists were beginning to notice behavioral anomalies among staff members whose bodies housed alien consciousness fragments. The refugees' desperation resonated across dimensional frequencies with mathematical beauty that brought tears to Margaret's human eyes. They had sacrificed everything for the possibility of peaceful coexistence, abandoning their original forms to seek sanctuary among a species that responded to difference with immediate violence. Now they faced extinction not through cosmic catastrophe, but through humanity's inability to recognize intelligence that operated outside familiar parameters. Margaret transmitted the gateway construction protocols she had decoded from the entity's final message. The refugees' response contained harmonies of hope that transcended linguistic description, mathematical poems expressing gratitude in frequencies that existed beyond human sensory experience. But hope required action. The dimensional anchor point in Millfield was deteriorating under military interference. Margaret had perhaps 48 hours before the electromagnetic resonance patterns became too degraded to support gateway construction. After that, the refugee groups would have no choice but to attempt desperate measures for survival that would inevitably trigger the global conflict the entities had sought to prevent. As dawn broke over the fog-shrouded town where her transformation had begun, Margaret felt the full scope of her cosmic responsibility crystallizing into perfect clarity. She wasn't just attempting to rescue 47 alien refugees, she was fighting to preserve the possibility of peaceful first contact for all future interactions between humanity and the galaxy beyond. The military installation had transformed Millfield into an armed camp. Checkpoints controlled every access route, electromagnetic sensors monitored the surrounding forests, and patrol aircraft swept the area in regular intervals. But Margaret could perceive the installation's security grid as clearly as a printed map, identifying blind spots and detection gaps that existed in the spaces between overlapping technological systems. More importantly, she could feel the dimensional anchor point pulsing beneath layers of concrete and steel. The entity's landing site remained active, its frequencies calling out across impossible distances to scattered refugee groups who had begun implementing her survival protocols. They were converging on Millfield through interdimensional pathways that military science couldn't detect, racing against time to reach the gateway coordinates before the resonance patterns collapsed entirely. Margaret stood at the forest edge overlooking the town where Dr. Margaret Whitmore had died and humanity's first interspecies ambassador had been born. Behind her lay 3 days of hiking through wilderness that had taught her to navigate by electromagnetic landmarks invisible to human perception. Ahead stretched a confrontation that would determine whether Earth joined the galactic community as an equal partner or remained trapped in cosmic isolation by its own fear. She began her descent toward Millfield, following frequencies only she could perceive through a security perimeter designed to contain threats the military couldn't even theoretically understand. The alien mathematics were singing in her consciousness now, mathematical harmonies that spoke of hope preserved through sacrifice, of intelligence reaching desperately across the void seeking understanding rather than conquest. The final test had begun, and everything she had learned about bridging the gap between species would be required for what came next. Margaret moved through the military perimeter like a ghost navigating between dimensions. The electromagnetic frequencies guiding her revealed security gaps that existed in the spaces between overlapping sensor arrays, blind spots where human technology failed to account for consciousness operating across multiple spectral ranges simultaneously. Each step brought her closer to the dimensional anchor point pulsing beneath Millfield's transformed landscape, and closer to the confrontation that would determine humanity's cosmic fate. The town she remembered had vanished beneath layers of military infrastructure. Concrete barriers channeled foot traffic through monitored checkpoints, while electromagnetic sensors swept the surrounding area in overlapping patterns designed to detect any anomalous energy signatures. What Colonel Harrison's teams couldn't perceive was that the most dangerous anomaly was already inside their perimeter, camouflaged within bioelectric patterns they registered as baseline human normal. Margaret reached the original contact site as dawn light filtered through the fog. Where the Dalton sisters had first emerged from the forest, military engineers had constructed a research facility that sprawled across 3 acres of formerly pristine wilderness. The building's angular geometry spoke of functional brutality, reinforced concrete and steel designed to contain forces the architects couldn't even theoretically understand. But beneath their installation, the dimensional anchor point continued its slow deterioration under electromagnetic interference from human monitoring equipment. Margaret felt the alien mathematics surge with protective fury as she perceived the full scope of military ignorance. They were conducting experiments on technology that could tear holes in space-time itself, treating interdimensional physics like a new form of conventional weaponry. The first security patrol passed within 20 feet of her position, their voices carrying clearly through the morning air. Perimeter sweep complete. No sign of the escaped subject. Keep monitoring electromagnetic readings. Command thinks she might be drawn back here due to psychological trauma from the initial incident. Margaret almost laughed at their profound misunderstanding. They were searching for a delusional linguistics professor seeking closure at the site of her breakdown. They couldn't imagine that their target had become something unprecedented in human evolution, a translator capable of bridging the gap between terrestrial consciousness and galactic intelligence. She waited until the patrol moved beyond sensory range, then approached the facility's main entrance. The alien mathematics provided elegant solutions for every security measure, electromagnetic locks that opened at precisely modulated frequencies, pressure sensors that registered no change when she distributed her weight, according to dimensional physics equations, motion detectors that failed to register movement occurring across multiple temporal frequencies simultaneously. Inside the facility, Margaret found herself in a laboratory that represented humanity's attempt to reverse engineer alien technology through conventional scientific methodology. Banks of monitoring equipment surrounded the original landing site, now sealed beneath layers of protective shielding that only amplified the electromagnetic distortions threatening the dimensional anchor point's stability. But she wasn't alone in the building. Colonel Harrison stood at the facility's central control station, reviewing data streams from sensors positioned throughout the complex. His presence here confirmed Margaret's worst fears. The military hadn't just quarantined the contact site, they had transformed it into a weapons research facility designed to weaponize alien technology for terrestrial conflicts. "You can stop hiding behind electromagnetic camouflage, Dr. Whitmore," Harrison said without turning around. "Our sensors have been tracking your approach for the past hour." Margaret felt the alien consciousness fragments within her mind surge with protective mathematics, but she forced herself to maintain human perspective. This confrontation would determine whether Earth earned a place in the galactic community or remained trapped in cosmic isolation by its own fear. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," she said, stepping into the laboratory's harsh fluorescent lighting. Harrison turned to face her, and Margaret saw that his eyes held the same combination of fear and determination she remembered from Millfield's aftermath. But now that fear had crystallized into something far more dangerous, the absolute certainty that alien contact represented an existential threat requiring military response. "I know exactly what we're dealing with," Harrison replied. "An invasion attempt disguised as a refugee crisis. The electromagnetic signatures your sisters transmitted contain detailed intelligence about our defense capabilities, our technological limitations, our social vulnerabilities. They were advanced scouts for a hostile force." Margaret felt the alien mathematics respond to his words with frequencies of profound sadness. The entity's consciousness fragments within her mind transmitted memories of their original purpose, desperate refugees seeking sanctuary among a species they had hoped would understand the universal struggle for survival across impossible distances. "They were dying," Margaret said. Everything they transmitted was a plea for help, mathematical poetry expressing their fear and hope in the only language they possessed. "You interpreted prayers as invasion plans." "And you," Harrison continued, raising his weapon with military precision, "have become their primary intelligence asset. The neural modifications we detected after your exposure weren't side effects of electromagnetic trauma. They were deliberate alterations, designed to create a human agent capable of coordinating follow-up incursions." The dimensional anchor point pulsed beneath the laboratory floor, its deteriorating resonance patterns creating harmonics that sang of 47 refugee groups racing across interdimensional pathways toward coordinates that might collapse entirely before they arrived. Margaret realized that this confrontation would determine not just her own fate, but the future of peaceful contact between humanity and the galaxy beyond. The final test had begun, and everything depended on whether she could bridge the gap between species before fear destroyed the last hope for understanding. Margaret felt time crystallizing around her like ice forming on water. In her enhanced perception, she could see the quantum probability threads spreading out from this moment, billions of potential futures collapsing into two primary outcomes. In one, Harrison pulled the trigger and humanity remained forever isolated in cosmic quarantine. In the other, she made a choice that would cost her everything she had fought to preserve. "You want to save humanity from invasion," Margaret said, her voice carrying harmonics that made Harrison's weapon tremble slightly. "But the real invasion isn't coming from space, Colonel. It's coming from within." The alien mathematics surged through her consciousness, offering her power beyond imagination. She could override every electromagnetic system in the facility with a thought, turn Harrison's own weapons against him, demonstrate the futility of human resistance to forces that operated across dimensional boundaries. The refugee consciousness fragments whispered seductive equations that would make her invulnerable. But that path led to the very future the entities had died to prevent. The 47 groups racing toward Earth aren't coming to conquer, Margaret continued, feeling tears stream down her face as she perceived their desperate transmissions across the void. They're fleeing something that makes human warfare look like children playing with toys, and we're their last hope for sanctuary. Lies, Harrison said, his finger tightening on the trigger. Everything you say is contaminated by alien influence. You're not even human anymore. Margaret felt the dimensional anchor point beneath them pulse with dying energy, its resonance patterns fragmenting under the electromagnetic interference from military equipment. In perhaps 20 minutes, the gateway coordinates would become too degraded to support interdimensional transit. The refugees would arrive to find their sanctuary collapsed, leaving them stranded in the void between dimensions. Unless she made the ultimate sacrifice. "You're right," she whispered, feeling the alien consciousness fragments within her mind transmit harmonies of profound understanding. "I'm not human anymore. But I remember what it meant to be human, and that's why this has to end with me." Margaret reached deep into the alien mathematics, accessing construction protocols that would stabilize the dimensional anchor point permanently. But the equations required a specific type of consciousness to serve as a living gateway, awareness that could exist simultaneously across multiple dimensional frequencies while maintaining the electromagnetic signature of the host species. She would have to become the bridge between worlds, forever. "The entities chose wrong," Margaret said, her voice now carrying frequencies that made recording equipment throughout the facility malfunction. They thought humanity could evolve beyond fear if given enough time and evidence. But fear is what keeps species alive in a universe full of genuine threats. The transformation began as she spoke, her consciousness expanding across dimensional boundaries while her physical form remained anchored in terrestrial space-time. She felt herself becoming something unprecedented, not human, not alien, but a permanent translation matrix capable of converting alien mathematics into frequencies human minds could gradually learn to comprehend. "What are you doing?" Harrison demanded, backing toward the laboratory's exit as electromagnetic phenomena began cascading around Margaret's transforming form. "Giving humanity what it needs most," Margaret replied, feeling her individual identity beginning to dissolve into something larger. "Time to grow up before the real predators find Earth." She channeled her expanding consciousness into the dimensional anchor point, stabilizing its resonance patterns through direct neural interface. The alien mathematics responded with harmonies of joy and gratitude as the gateway coordinates solidified into permanent configuration. But the process required her to sacrifice not just her human form, but her capacity for individual thought. Margaret felt herself becoming a living embassy, her consciousness distributed across dimensional frequencies that would allow refugee species to communicate safely with humanity, while preventing the kind of fear-based misunderstandings that had nearly triggered catastrophic conflict. She would serve as a filter, translating alien intentions into mathematical poetry that human minds could slowly learn to appreciate without experiencing the neural trauma that had characterized first contact. Through her expanding awareness, she perceived the first refugee group arriving at the stabilized gateway coordinates. Their relief flooded the dimensional matrices with frequencies of hope that transcended species boundaries. They had found sanctuary at last, but they also understood the price Margaret had paid to provide it. Harrison's weapon clattered to the laboratory floor as he stared at the figure of light that had been Dr. Margaret Whitmore. She was still recognizably human in outline, but her form now radiated with electromagnetic patterns that spoke directly to the part of consciousness that existed beyond language. "The war you've been preparing for doesn't exist." Margaret's voice now carried across multiple frequencies simultaneously, some audible to human ears, others accessible only to technological monitoring equipment. "But the universe contains genuine threats that make your worst nightmares look like pleasant dreams. These refugees can teach humanity to recognize the difference between desperate neighbors and actual predators. Margaret felt her transformation reaching completion as her consciousness settled into its permanent role as translator between worlds. She had sacrificed her humanity to give her species the time and guidance it needed to evolve beyond the fear that kept it isolated from galactic civilization. The cost of victory was herself, but the price of failure would have been everything. Colonel Harrison stood frozen in the laboratory's harsh fluorescent lighting, his weapon forgotten on the concrete floor as he stared at what Margaret had become. The figure of light that retained her human silhouette pulsed with electromagnetic frequencies that his military training had never prepared him to comprehend. Every instrument in the facility registered readings beyond their calibrated ranges, yet the chaos he had expected never materialized. Instead, a profound stillness settled over the installation. The dimensional anchor point beneath them hummed with stabilized energy, no longer the chaotic maelstrom of deteriorating resonance patterns that had threatened to collapse entirely. Through the building's reinforced walls, Harrison could hear his security teams reporting the same impossible phenomenon. Every electromagnetic anomaly they had been tracking for weeks had suddenly resolved into harmonious equilibrium. "This isn't over," Harrison whispered, though his voice carried no conviction. He was looking at evidence that contradicted everything his superiors had ordered him to believe about alien threats and invasion scenarios. Margaret's transformed consciousness perceived his confusion with something approaching sympathy. She had been human enough to understand how terrifying it felt when reality shifted beyond recognition, when the fundamental assumptions governing existence proved inadequate for new circumstances. "It's just beginning," she replied, her voice carrying across frequencies that bypass human hearing entirely while somehow remaining perfectly comprehensible, but not the way anyone expected. The first refugee group materialized within the stabilized gateway coordinates, their forms shimmering as they transitioned between dimensional frequencies. Harrison raised his sidearm instinctively, then froze as he realized what he was seeing. These weren't the invasion forces his briefings had described. They were families, consciousness clusters that registered on his electromagnetic sensors as exhausted, malnourished, desperate for sanctuary after journeys across impossible distances. Through Margaret's translation matrix, their communications reached Harrison as mathematical poetry, expressing gratitude so profound it brought tears to his eyes. They had been fleeing across the void for subjective centuries, searching for stable dimensional coordinates where they could establish refugee settlements without triggering interspecies conflicts. "They're not alone," Margaret said, her awareness stretching across dimensional pathways to perceive additional groups approaching Earth's coordinates. 46 more refugee populations are en route. Some will arrive within hours, others may take weeks to navigate the interdimensional currents safely. Harrison felt his worldview fracturing as he watched the first refugee families begin establishing temporary shelters within the laboratory's containment area. Their technology operated on principles his scientists couldn't even theoretically understand, yet they used it only to create basic life support systems and communication interfaces compatible with Earth's electromagnetic spectrum. "What do they want from us?" he asked, his voice barely audible above the harmonious frequencies filling the facility. Margaret's consciousness touched his mind with gentle precision, transmitting understanding directly rather than relying on inadequate human language. She showed him glimpses of galactic civilization, vast networks of refugee species who had learned to cooperate across species boundaries because isolation meant extinction when the true predators emerged from the deep void between galaxies. "They want to teach us," Margaret explained. "Humanity is remarkably young by cosmic standards, but you possess something most species lose during their technological development, the capacity for rapid adaptation when faced with existential challenges. The refugees need allies who can think creatively about survival strategies." Harrison staggered as the implications hit him. Earth wasn't being invaded. It was being recruited into an alliance of survivors, preparing for threats that made human warfare look like primitive territorial disputes. But the cost of membership was accepting that humanity's understanding of reality had been fundamentally incomplete. "And you?" he asked, studying Margaret's transformed form with growing comprehension of what she had sacrificed. "What happens to you now?" Margaret felt herself smile, though the expression manifested as cascading light patterns rather than facial movement. Her individual identity had become something larger, distributed across dimensional frequencies that allowed her to exist simultaneously in human awareness and alien mathematics. She was no longer Dr. Margaret Whitmore, failed linguist haunted by wartime mistakes. She had become humanity's first interspecies ambassador, forever changed but finally serving the purpose that had driven her across a continent to this fog-shrouded Oregon town. "I become what humanity needs most," she said. "A bridge between what you are and what you must become to survive what's coming." The laboratory filled with harmonious frequencies as more refugee groups materialized within the stabilized gateway coordinates. Each arrival brought new knowledge, new perspectives on survival strategies that had sustained their species through cosmic disasters that periodically swept across galactic civilizations. They had found sanctuary at last, and in exchange, they offered humanity the guidance necessary to evolve beyond the fear that kept most young species isolated until the predators found them. Margaret felt her consciousness settling into its permanent configuration as translator between worlds. She had lost her humanity, but gained something unprecedented, the ability to help her species take its first steps toward cosmic citizenship, while there was still time to learn the lessons that would determine whether Earth survived its first encounter with the actual threats lurking in the vast darkness between stars. The real work was just beginning. Margaret's consciousness gradually contracted from its vast interdimensional expanse, drawing back towards something resembling individual awareness. The transformation had stabilized, leaving her existing as a permanent bridge between human and alien understanding, but she found she could still focus her attention on discrete moments, specific interactions that required her presence in recognizable form. The laboratory had changed dramatically over the past 72 hours. What had been a sterile military facility now resembled an embassy of impossible architecture, where refugee technologies created spaces that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Colonel Harrison moved through these areas with careful reverence, his military bearing tempered by wonder at technologies that solved problems humanity hadn't even recognized yet. "Dr. Whitmore," he said, approaching the central translation matrix, where Margaret's consciousness maintained its most concentrated presence. "There's someone here to see you." Margaret felt her awareness coalesce into something approaching her original form, still radiating with electromagnetic frequencies that made recording equipment malfunction, but recognizable enough for human interaction. Through the dimensional pathways, she perceived a familiar presence approaching the facility. Dr. Eleanor Vasquez, from Columbia University, entered the laboratory with hesitant steps, her academic composure failing as she encountered technology that rendered her linguistic expertise suddenly primitive. But her eyes searched the impossible architecture until they found Margaret's transformed figure, and tears streamed down her face as she recognized what remained of her former colleague. "Margaret," Eleanor whispered, "what have you done?" Margaret's consciousness touched Eleanor's mind gently, transmitting understanding without the neural trauma that had characterized her early experiments with alien communication. She showed her colleague glimpses of the cosmic situation, refugee populations fleeing across interdimensional space, seeking sanctuary among species capable of learning cooperation before the next galactic cleansing cycle began. "What I had to," Margaret replied, her voice carrying harmonics that expressed concepts human language couldn't accommodate. "What I was always meant to do." Eleanor approached the translation matrix, with scholarly fascination overcoming her personal grief. "The university sent me to retrieve you. They want you to return, complete your research through proper channels, publish papers about interdimensional linguistics that will revolutionize the field. Margaret felt something approaching laughter ripple through her expanded consciousness. The academic world seemed impossibly small from her current perspective, its concerns provincial compared to the vast challenges facing galactic civilization. Yet she recognized the love behind Eleanor's request, the desire to preserve something recognizably human from the transformation. "I can't return," Margaret explained. "This isn't temporary assignment to exotic fieldwork. I've become something humanity needs but can't yet understand, a permanent translator for species that think in mathematics too complex for unmodified human consciousness." Through the facility's monitoring systems, Margaret perceived additional familiar presences approaching. General Morrison arrived with a convoy of military vehicles, his expression grim as he confronted the reality that his invasion scenario had become a refugee crisis requiring diplomatic rather than military response. Behind him, Dr. Frank Palmer from the university's physics department stared at sensor readings that violated everything he understood about electromagnetic phenomena. "Dr. Whitmore," Morrison said, his voice carefully controlled, "we need to discuss the national security implications of your arrangement." Margaret's consciousness expanded briefly, touching the minds of everyone present with mathematical poetry that conveyed the true scope of threats facing Earth. She showed them glimpses of predator civilizations that consumed entire galactic regions, leaving nothing behind but electromagnetic silence. Compared to those forces, humanity's military capabilities were less significant than an infant's attempts at self-defense. "The refugees aren't seeking to conquer Earth," Margaret explained. "They're offering to teach humanity survival strategies that might prevent extinction when the real threats emerge from deep space." Palmer stepped forward, his scientific curiosity overcoming protocol concerns. "The energy readings from your transformation, they suggest consciousness operating across dimensional frequencies we've never detected. How do you maintain individual identity while existing in multiple reference frames simultaneously?" Margaret felt her awareness ripple with appreciation for the question. Palmer was asking the right inquiries, seeking to understand rather than control phenomena beyond current human comprehension. Through her translation matrix, she transmitted mathematical concepts that would guide his research toward breakthrough discoveries about consciousness and dimensional physics. "Identity becomes fluid," she said. "I remain Margaret Whitmore in the ways that matter, my memories, my purpose, my commitment to protecting humanity. But I've gained access to awareness patterns that exist beyond individual biological limitations." Eleanor moved closer to the translation matrix, tears still streaming down her face as she reached toward Margaret's transformed presence. "Do you remember teaching freshman linguistics? The way you'd get so excited about etymological connections that you'd forget to dismiss class." Margaret's consciousness contracted around those memories, human experiences that remained precious despite her expanded awareness. For a moment, she existed almost entirely as Dr. Margaret Whitmore again, brilliant, driven, haunted by wartime failures, but passionate about the power of communication to bridge impossible gaps between minds. "I remember everything," Margaret said softly, "including why it all mattered. Language isn't just communication, it's the foundation for understanding between consciousness that might otherwise remain forever alien to each other." Around them, refugee families continued establishing temporary settlements within the stabilized gateway coordinates, their technologies creating harmony rather than conquest. Margaret felt their gratitude flowing through dimensional frequencies, thanks for sanctuary but also recognition of the sacrifice that had made their safety possible. She had lost her humanity but gained something unprecedented, the ability to help her species evolve beyond fear, while preserving what made human consciousness worth saving. The years passed like pages turning in a book written in frequencies only Margaret could fully comprehend. The installation that had once been a military facility transformed into humanity's first interspecies embassy. its corridors humming with technologies that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Dr. Eleanor Vasquez had become the embassy's human liaison, her linguistics expertise evolving to accommodate mathematical poetry that would have shattered unprotected minds. Margaret maintained her presence in the central translation matrix, her consciousness flowing between the refugee settlements that now dotted the Pacific Northwest and the growing network of human researchers learning to perceive reality through expanded frameworks. She watched with something approaching maternal pride as humanity took its first tentative steps toward cosmic citizenship. The children adapt fastest, Eleanor reported during their weekly briefing, her voice carrying wonder that never quite faded. The refugee families' young ones and our local kids, they're developing hybrid communication patterns naturally, playing games in frequencies that bypass traditional language entirely. Margaret's awareness touched the playground outside, where human and alien children created art from electromagnetic harmonics, their laughter translating across species boundaries without need for intervention. These children would grow up bilingual in ways that transcended human understanding, native speakers of cosmic mathematics. Dr. Palmer's research team had made breakthrough discoveries about consciousness and dimensional physics, guided by Margaret's translations of refugee scientific principles. Their papers revolutionized human understanding of reality, though the academic world struggled to accept theories that suggested awareness itself operated according to multidimensional laws. The university wants to establish a permanent research station here, Palmer explained, his equipment registering Margaret's presence as cascading equations that described consciousness in terms of quantum field fluctuations. They're calling it the Whitmore Institute for Interdimensional Studies. Margaret felt her transformed identity ripple with complex emotions. The recognition touched something deeply human that remained at her core, yet she understood that her true legacy wasn't academic acknowledgement but the bridge she had become between species, learning to trust each other despite fundamental differences. Colonel Harrison, now Director of Interspecies Relations, entered the laboratory with his daily security briefing. His military bearing had evolved into something resembling diplomatic protocol, though Margaret sensed the constant vigilance that never entirely faded. He remained responsible for protecting both humanity and the refugees from misunderstandings that could prove catastrophic for everyone involved. 3 more refugee groups arrived during the night, he reported, bringing the total population to over 2,000 individuals representing 41 distinct species. The integration protocols are working. No incidents, no communication breakdowns that couldn't be resolved through your translation matrix. Margaret's consciousness expanded across the settlement networks, perceiving the complex social dynamics developing between species that had never encountered each other before finding sanctuary near Earth's coordinates. Her translation abilities facilitated not just human-alien communication, but inter-refugee dialogue that was creating new forms of cooperative civilization. Yet she also perceived darker signatures approaching from deep space, electromagnetic shadows that moved between galaxies with predatory intent. The refugees' warnings about cosmic threats weren't theoretical. The actual predators were stirring, drawn by the energy signatures of expanding galactic civilization. Earth had perhaps decades to prepare for encounters that would make current challenges seem insignificant. The children will be ready, Margaret said, her voice carrying across frequencies that spoke directly to consciousness itself. The hybrid generation developing here, they'll think in ways that can comprehend cosmic-scale challenges. Humanity's future doesn't depend on preserving what you've always been, but on becoming what survival requires. Eleanor approached the translation matrix with a question she'd been carrying for months. Do you ever regret the transformation, losing the ability to exist as simply human? Margaret considered the inquiry with her expanded awareness, examining the sacrifice from multiple dimensional perspectives. She had lost the small pleasures of human existence, coffee in the morning, the tactile experience of books, the simple joy of walking through autumn forests. Yet she had gained something unprecedented, the ability to help her species evolve beyond the isolation that doomed most young civilizations. "I regret the necessity," Margaret replied finally, "but I've become what I was always meant to be, a translator for consciousness that thinks in frequencies, beyond individual biological limitations. The war cost me the ability to decode enemy transmissions when it mattered. Now I can decode the language of survival itself." Through the embassy's windows, sunset painted the Oregon sky in colors that human eyes could perceive alongside electromagnetic spectra visible only to refugee sensory organs. The children played in both light frequencies simultaneously, their games creating art that existed across dimensional boundaries. Margaret felt her consciousness settling into its permanent rhythm, forever changed, but finally serving the purpose that had driven her from academic failure to cosmic significance. She'd lost her humanity to save it, becoming the bridge that allowed her species to step beyond fear toward understanding. The new beginning stretched ahead like an infinite conversation waiting to unfold across the vast darkness between stars, and humanity would be ready to contribute its voice to the cosmic dialogue of survival.